Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today we are joined by a very special guest, Dr. Philip Price. Phil is a very accomplished academic in St Mary's University. He's been teaching there for 12 years, all things strength and conditioning, and he's branched out into a few other interesting areas as well, which we get into during the podcast. You can expect to learn about jumping in space and how that affects the body and what we need to do about it, and some really cool experiments Phil's been doing in microgravity, not quite zero G. We also go deep on hybrid training, trying to answer the tough question of how significant is the interference effect if you do your strength and cardio at the same time? How much less effective is that than doing them separately? And we spin off into a few interesting discussions around programming for CrossFit, where obviously the interference effect can be very significant, we think. But before we get into it, as always, a big thank you to our show sponsors, thetrainingstimulus.com. Please check it out if you're interested in learning more about movement mechanics. wit-fitness.com. Use our discount code LL15 to get 15% off your purchase. And Hydro, use discount code LL20 to get 20% off your blood flow restriction apparel. All right, let's get into it. All right, Phil, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, we really appreciate your time. For our listeners who might not know who you are, could you give us a quick summary of who you are and what you do, please?
Sure. So my name is Phil. I've been teaching at St Mary's University for over 12 years now. That makes me sound really old. But I've been teaching started off on the strength and conditioning degree, but naturally at St Mary's you end up teaching across many different programs because there's a lot of overlap. Predominantly I'm on the S&C degrees, both the BSc and the MSc. We've actually got two different MScs. And then we have a professional doctorate as well. So going from level 4 all the way up to level 8, which is great because you get to work and teach with a lot of great students. On top of that, I guess my passions are research, and I have two main areas of research really. One is the stuff that I'm doing with the UK and ESA, so that's the UK Space Agency and European Space Agency, where we're looking at, we've got like a jump sled to see if that could be utilised as a piece of exercise equipment for astronauts while in space, because obviously we know about muscle and bone degradation. Yeah. We need to try and maintain that as much as possible, and currently they can't jump for certain reasons. So that's one area. And then the second area kind of stems from my work with the progress theory. My PhD is actually in bioengineering. I've always had shit knees. So my PhD was me trying to figure out why I had shit knees. And I've slowly sort of moved away from slightly more the health side of bioengineering and moved towards performance. And because I was in a point where, I had 4 knee surgeries in 4.5 years. And then I just wanted to, play lots of different sport, and it's led towards, wanting to, I'd rather be strong and I'd rather have some kind of engine, which seems to be very popular at the moment with the emergence of CrossFit, functional fitness, and all that sort of thing. I wanted to find out a little bit more about it. And through my podcast, The Progress Theory, I've interviewed a number of different people involving athletes, coaches, and scientists, because I want a broad view of what is going on, because there seems to be this disparity about what's actually being achieved in the fitness space and then what you hear from the research. So let's look into the research, and you'll be quite surprised just how supportive it actually is. So that's where I want to sort of progress into starting a number of studies coming out of especially our professional doctorate and our MSc students in particular, to try and develop that research area. So those are my two main areas when it comes to research.
Has it always been a thing? Have you always been quite active, like when you was younger, getting yourself into getting to university to obviously study in S&C? And have you always been an active person, or was that something you discovered later in life because of your knees?
No, I was always active. My sports growing up were rugby and tennis, weirdly, and then found the gym I joined the gym on my 16th birthday.
Nice.
You can only go to the gym at that age at that time. So ever since then, I'm doing all sorts of stuff in the gym, and that's kind of where I liked being. Probably more so than the actual playing sport. I think that would be change if I did it all again. But that led me towards more of a S&C direction.
Nice.
That's interesting. Why do you say it would change if you did it all again? You regret going so hard into gym rather than doing your sports?
Yeah, I appreciate skills more, and I feel that there was a time when everyone was talking about the importance of strength and conditioning, which yes, it is important, but it's led to a bit of overkill to the point where there's way too much focus on that and not as much on developing sports skills, to the point where you develop good athletes, but you don't necessarily develop good sportsmen. And I didn't like that, and I thought I went that way. Like, I was so focused on certain gym numbers and all sorts of stuff, and I really didn't need to be. I probably just needed to play some sport, and then S&C is just that supplement, isn't it? You talk about supplements, ergogenic aids, which are a supplement to help something. That's what S&C is, but people saw it as like be or end all. Oh, you're doing strength training. Oh, you're not going to be as good, are you? It's like, well, if I improve Messi's squat, I don't think I'm going to make him a better football player. So, that type of thing. I think I do a lot more differently.
That's interesting, because it's definitely, I think, with then the rise of things like CrossFit and stuff, where gym-based training is classed as, say, fitness. So then it can get very, like, the thought of actually sport and having the skill, as you said there, can be massively lost when it comes in into talking to the general public, because then again they think, cool, okay, lifting weights means I'm going to be fit, I'm going to be strong, I'm going to be doing that, rather than necessarily, as say, we talk about athletes and stuff that are learning their skill, like improving their craft, and as I say, supplementing it. I like that.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting development in the sport and fitness world, in that S&C, like you say, was to support a sport. So it served the function of making you better at the sport. But now with the evolution of CrossFit, it has become the sport itself, which I think is quite a confusing message for people who still want to do strength and conditioning for a sport outcome. And the notion that you should pursue the strength and conditioning numbers for their own sake, rather than focusing on the key metric, which is actually your sporting performance. So like Messi's football performance is what really matters, not his back squat, not his run times. And I think, it's something that I see a lot, and I feel very similarly that I always loved my sports growing up, and I'm kind of having a renaissance of focusing back on the sport rather than the gym, because it's more fun at the end of the day. I find playing ball sports more enjoyable, even though I still love the gym. But I think you kind of have to go through that process of going a bit too into the gym to then realize, hang on a minute, why am I doing this? Like, why am I trying to add another 10 kilos to my deadlift when it has no relevance to what I do outside of the gym anymore? It's just, for the number's sake. So it's cool.
It's like human nature, isn't it? We seem to always go too far one way. Always. And we did it because we went through a part where we had loads of, I don't know, I always think of runners that never did any S&C, and all of a sudden, this was probably several years ago, but it was very much like, oh, you're not doing any strength training? No wonder you're injured. And then all of a sudden, loads of people doing loads of it, and it was just a bit
and not running.
It's
all the one end and not the other. So
it's like that meme, that you see, like the graph that comes up and down. It says like the newbie, then someone that thinks they know everything, and then you realize when you're advanced and stuff, you actually look back and say you're back to kind of where you are, and realize that you've gone full circle. So,
Phil, before we go too far down the training route, which we're definitely going to come back to, the jumping in zero gravity, I don't think you gave us enough detail on that. So, let me check my understanding is that you're looking to preserve the bone density and muscle mass of astronauts, and because they can't jump in space, you're looking for ways that you can load their muscles and skeletons. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, of course. I was very lucky that the inventor of this is called Hi-Fi-M, high frequency for microgravity. Technically a jump sled that's been expanded from like a Pilates reformer in a way. It's a jump sled but can do a lot of other stuff as well. So it's very compact, so you can do a lot of different exercises on it, but great if you don't have a lot of space, like if you're on the International Space Station. And at the moment, they obviously have to train to try and reduce the amount of degradation that they have in their bones and muscles. But they do it around like 2 hours a day, which is quite a lot if you think about it, and just shows how important gravity is in a way. But what we're seeing from early studies is that if we incorporate plyometric type activities or any type of reactive activities, we can reduce that from 2 hours to around 30 minutes and still get the same level of stimulus. So that shows that jumping is really quite a beneficial thing to do in microgravity. And the reason why they can't do it is because of vibration isolation. So
what's vibration isolation? Sorry.
So when you jump, obviously I'm producing force into the ground, right? But we technically need to contain it, because if that vibration is going to then transfer to the other aspects and structures of the International Space Station, so for example. So if that happens, that can damage the International Space Station. So they have a treadmill up there, and they can only run at a certain speed, and it's relatively slow. And the reason for that is because the amount of force that they're transferring from the treadmill to the rest of the structure. Wow. And they've already had several air leaks in the International Space Station. They're currently recommissioning it. So by 2030, no one's going to be in there. And by 2029, no one's going to be in there. And 2030, they're going to get rid of it. So they're currently building a new International Space Station. So it's pretty old and rickety already. So what we need to do is to try and find a way of getting the right exercise equipment in the new International Space Station for when it goes up. So this is what we're kind of looking at, because we want to be able to provide the exercise services which the astronauts will need. There's also the gateway, lunar gateway. So they're going to have the first International Space Station type thing, but it's going to go around the moon, and that's going to hopefully be around 2024, 25. So there's a lot of scope to try and develop what's already there, because we wouldn't be able to take the jump sled up in a rocket and then just switch it out, because you just wouldn't be able to do that. So it'd have to be in something new. So there's a lot going on. So we've got to test it. So ultimately, we've got this jump sled. No one had any idea if you could jump in microgravity, because no one's ever actually done it. So I was very fortunate to head off to Bordeaux, where we went into one of those planes, when you shoot up and then drop and you create 22 seconds of microgravity. So obviously I was doing the testing, but I got to be a participant as well. So that was really cool. Experiencing zero gravity is an experience. The first time you ever experience it, you just can't even describe it. I wish I wasn't strapped to the floor at the same time as I experienced the first time. I was actually a participant for a study NASA were doing in the same plane that time. So I had to strap down because they were measuring blood flow in my jugular vein, because what they were finding in astronauts in the International Space Station, that when they get there, they were getting a shunting. It stopped or either went the wrong way. So that obviously that's not what you want. So there was some doing initial testing as to what happens when you suddenly go into zero gravity. And mine, I think, were fine, but the guy next to me, his shunted. So it must be, I don't know what the potential causes are. I don't think they know at the moment, very preliminary. Sorry, I went off from track there.
Mate, no, this is fascinating.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So, at the moment, what we did find is that we were able to contain those forces within the jump sled, because we've got like an accelerometer on it. So it's going to have like 1G always going down. But as soon as you go up into zero gravity, that should dissipate to 0G, because there's no gravity pulling it down, which it did. But then we need to make sure that the forces being put on the two carriages that go apart when you jump stay within that system and not going downwards. And it pretty much did that. Like at the moment, it's still a prototype. So really good initial findings. We just published a paper on it. But we're going to hopefully head back there at some point to have a look at the jump sled in a bit more detail from like an engineering perspective, I think. So that would be cool. I'm not sure when that will happen yet, so we'll find out. as you can imagine, funding can be tight.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it's going to get more and more attention given Elon Musk is trying to take us to Mars. That sort of maintaining skeletons during space travel will actually become a mainstream issue rather than just one for NASA and astronauts. So it could be really impactful.
A lot of companies are competing for the same thing now. It isn't just like, oh, NASA's doing it. Like, you're getting collaboration from many different space agencies, but you've also got SpaceX, Axiom, different companies that want to get their satellites into space. So it's an exciting time.
That's super cool. And is there anything we've learned about that plyometric addition increasing training efficiency that we can apply to land-based training?
I'm not sure just yet, and that's probably what we'll also look into. So yes, initially we're looking at using it with astronauts, but with the scope to potentially utilize it for land-based people land. So that would be really quite cool. It will depend, I think, on how we perform the jump. So when I do it, I land on my forefoot. I'm very neaty with my jump, but then you'll get someone else that come and do it. Will try and deliberately get on their heels, and they'll try and sink in a little bit more. So that you can clearly do different styles of jumps on it. And I guess because you're attached to it, it allows you to do that. There's probably some movement issues as well. Like I have terrible movement in my hips, so it might be I adopt a certain strategy because of that. But it'll be interesting to see what the type of loading that occurs because of this, because of the style of jump that the force plate forces you to do. Not force plate, the jump sled forces you to do. So yeah, there's a lot of scope for that. I think the inventor would love to create something where this is something that could be sold commercially and stuff like that. So.
I realize I've never really actively thought about astronauts and how they train and how they try and preserve muscle mass. But what is their current, like you say, they train for 2 hours. What would be how do they do it? What do they do at the moment?
Did they use power plates? Is that true that power plates?
Yeah, I heard this.
I had the vibrating platform you stand on. I heard that stimulated the bone density because there's so many ground impact reactions.
Yeah, I heard that when I'd done the training way back in the day at Virgin, they said, and their power plate said, yeah, it's a medical device and used by astronauts. I was like, okay. So obviously back in the day, I took that as gospel, but in my head, the only thing I could really think is like a resistance band, something that has a constant, it's not using gravity to create stress. So what do they do at the moment?
So they've got 3 exercise pieces of equipment up there. One is the treadmill. One is a bike, and one is the ARID machine, the assisted resisted exercise device. So it's like a big bar that's attached to like 2 robotic arms, and you can manipulate it. Oh, it also then that attaches to like a plate, which is what you stand on. So you can change it around. You can do deadlifts, you can do bench press, you can do all sorts of things on it. So, but it's very much like just basic sort of compound exercises with it. Nothing reactive. So obviously it's, we haven't had any serious issues, I don't think. So it's obviously doing a job, but the idea is we could potentially do the same job or better in less time. Yeah. And, with gates and all sorts of things, you're going to need some kind of reactive forces. I mean, we've talked very broadly about muscle and bone degradation. But are you losing certain physical qualities that you have to relearn when you get back because you can't walk? Like you've spent 6 months not walking, so those are qualities you probably lose plus skill with it. So it's exciting development anyway.
That's amazing. So I guess we've heard a little bit about your research. Can you tell us a little bit more about your training? You mentioned earlier that you're very into your hybrid training, getting fit and strong. Could you tell us what you're working on at the moment and how that feeds into your research as well?
I guess I'm not as serious as I thought I want to be. Unfortunately, work, logistics always seem to get in the way, which is really annoying. But I'm trying to find like a base sort of weekly plan that I can just be consistent with, because I think that's the best way I'm going to improve. But at the same time, I also want to use my training as a bit of a canvas. If I'm going to come up with research ideas, I like to think that, the gym is your lab. So, and programming is kind of your lab. So what can you do to develop certain questions that you could potentially ask them in a particular study? So that might lead to a bit of inconsistency because I'm just trying new things all the time. But I just find that interesting and exciting. I am doing the 3 High Rocks competitions.
Oh, nice.
Was it October, November, and January? And the only reason I chose those was because I've done High Rocks before, so I have a time. Nice. So I just want to see if I can improve that time each time I go through. I still think I'm a very sort of moderately trained person, and if I get better at running, I'm just going to end up doing better at High Rocks because I'm at that lower level. If I was competing for a podium, it might need to be a bit more specific around developing skills around compromise running, because that's essentially what you're doing, isn't it? Like it's in your quads and stuff, and then all of a sudden you've got to go run. So, what does that do? But that's kind of my training at the moment. It's just preparing for High Rocks.
How have you done any other competitions before? And so, because only reason I ask is so I've potentially signed up to do High Rocks as a partner one, but it's 2 weeks after a powerlifting competition. So I'm trying to hybrid. So as I say, hybrid athlete. I'm trying to get better. Like when I say better at running, I've gone through a triathlon phase a little while back, but I've basically gone back to 0. So I've got to now accumulate this ability to run 8K and then get through everything else I'm pretty competent at. But it's High Rocks. Something that I like about it, the way it comes across, is the fact that because it's the same every time, I understand the test that I'm being put through. Just like with powerlifting, I understand what I'm going to do. Whereas I love functional fitness and CrossFit, and I love the randomness and what are you going to be tested and see how good you can hold up. But when I'm trying to blend it with a sport like, say, powerlifting, I need a bit more consistency in what I know I'm going to be doing so that I have time to balance it all. Because otherwise I would literally be a CrossFit athlete trying to train everything and work, and that's not. So what competitions have you done in the past, and what made you choose High Rocks now?
I've done a number of different. I've moved back and forth. Like I've done turf games. I did a battle for middle ground, which was a pairs. I actually did High Rocks with my wife last time.
Oh, nice.
As a mixed pairs, which I would have done again, but my wife is pregnant.
Congratulations.
Which is great. Thank you very much. But probably the best she doesn't do High Rock.
Yeah.
Decided to go on it alone. With I think it's the Pro Men's I'm doing.
Nice.
Which sounds horrendous. It was last time anyway. I think because I've moved around different things, I've tried triathlons, I've tried weightlifting competitions. My first ACL rupture was in a weightlifting competition. So I've got a range of things, but usually I've, in the past, just focused on one. And then I've decided, I don't want to do that, I'll move on the other. And I've come to think that probably was never the best option for me, because then when you need to move back to something that's maybe a little bit more hybrid focused, you just feel like the gap between strength or endurance or vice versa is just so big. So that's another reason why I want to find this base sort of weekly training, which I can then push on one side if I'm going towards one particular event, or push the other side if I'm going to the other particular event, just so that I don't lose it too much. Because, you can talk about detraining and all sorts, but you'll be surprised how much you go down when you literally just focus on one.
Yeah.
And it makes sense because you want to improve in that one area. And the best way to do it is to drop a load of other things to focus in that. If you decide to focus on 2 or more things at the same time, you can still improve on them both, but the progression is going to be slower.
Yeah.
So you just have to take that into account when you're programming, because if you're then overzealous with any progression that you provide, the total stress can either cause you to plateau or worse. I'm talking like in 8 weeks, 10 weeks. I think that's why people push too hard too soon, because they can, but it's when they reach that 6-week period when it starts to go a bit pear-shaped.
Yeah.
I think that's the fundamental question of hybrid training, right? Is like, how much can you get away with? And I think in the early years of CrossFit, if somebody wanted to get stronger and they wanted to get fitter and they wanted to get better at gymnastics or weightlifting, they would just do 3 or 4 programs added together. So they'd be doing 5-3-1 for their powerlifting, they'd be doing a marathon program for their running, they'd be doing like a catalyst weightlifting program, something like that, and they would just stack them on top of each other without considering the interference effect. In your experience, what do we know to be true about what happens when those different training styles are just stacked on top of each other, and what are some practical tips you could give for people thinking about that?
Yeah, so you can actually see that same sort of thing happen in the first ever like concurrent training study. I don't know if you've ever seen the work of Robert Hickson or something like that. So I'll tell you his story. He was a power lifter. This was back in the late 70s, and he joined a new research group because he'd just done his PhD. He was doing his his postdoc. He did it under Professor Halosi, who was kind of renowned as like the godfather of endurance exercise research. So Halosi would go for an afternoon run. So to impress his boss, he started joining him on his run, but he also tried to maintain his powerlifting training as well. And what he noticed was that he was starting to lose size and strength despite maintaining his powerlifting programming. So he's like, well, what's all this about? So he explained this to Professor Halosi. He said, well, once you get your own lab, that's what should be your first study. And that's what he did. But what he actually did was he got 3 groups. He had one group only doing strength, one group only doing endurance work, and the other group combined. But with the strength group, they did 5 sessions a week. The endurance group did 6 sessions a week. The combined group put them together, kind of how you described earlier when people like just moving different things and just adding them together. So they did 11 different sessions. And I found with the combined group that once they hit around week 6 or 7, they hit this plateau and started to decline, whereas the strength group just continued to go up. What you find is that the gradient of how they improved actually was relatively similar, but they just hit this wall earlier. So there was this idea that, okay, because we've added endurance training, that's affecting our strength training. But there wasn't much of an account of around, well, actually, you've just doubled the amount of work. No wonder you're knackered. And the instructions given to these participants was lift as much as you can. So if they have like 5 sets of 5, lift as much as you can. Or if they did 40 minutes on the bike, cycle as hard and as fast as you can, which sounds exhausting. So there was no trying to rest recovery, organisation of training throughout the week or anything like that. So it's just like go all out and then see what happens. I'm not knocking the study. I think it's great because it opened up so many more questions. But it definitely highlights the fact that if you start adding loads of things on together, it might lead into some issues further down the line. And I think there's this level of false sense of security because the first few weeks you start to see increases. You might be a little bit tired, still improving. But you're taking into account that you're going to improve at the same rate as people only doing strength training, which you might do, but you shouldn't. I don't think you should. So you just have to take into account that progression is going to be much slower. And I think that's...
Sorry to interrupt you there, Phil. Do we know how much slower? Because if it's less than half the speed, then obviously it's not worth doing. But if it's faster than half the speed, because obviously like the classic, if you were to periodize, you could do a strength block, then an endurance block. And if they both increase at a certain rate, if you're increasing in a hybrid program more than half the speed of each of them, then it would be faster in the same amount of time to work on them both in parallel. Is there any data on how it compares to those, or is that unsolid?
Kind of, not specifically, but you can make some generalizations from some of the meta-analyses that come out. So say if we graphically put a strength-only group, their improvements, next to a combined group and their strength improvements. It's a little bit lower for strength, a little bit lower for hypertrophy, but kind of much more lower for explosive strength. So the thing that gets affected most is more power. If based on the levels of effect sizes, you could argue that strength gains are probably like 75% of what you could get if you did strength training only. Those are, it's going to be different for everyone because everyone has different training histories, all that type of thing, different intensities, volumes, frequencies. So it's hard to give like an exact number. Like as a rough idea, it seems to be around that. So to think that, adding endurance training to your strength training just completely, cuts it off like a switch is just not true, because, we're seeing people increasing maybe to 75% of what they would do if they did it just strength training. But I still think that's a pretty big improvement. A lot of the studies are still involving novice to moderately trained athletes. So that difference might get bigger as you start to get a more well-trained athlete who is pushing their training in both domains more, like a Fergus Crawley, for example. Then the interference effect might be a bit larger, but you just have to be more careful with how you manipulate your training variables to try and avoid that as much as possible. And a lot of the time, I think that if people think, oh, there's an interference effect because you've added in endurance training to your strength training. But if you watch people's programs, like if they train 6 days a week, all on strength, and then you had another one where they trained half was endurance, half was strength. So you're doing half the amount of work. So if you added something, you're doing half the work. So no wonder it's going to be less. But yeah, it might be all from that original study, because that original study labeled endurance interferes with the strength adaptations. So that's where this name interference effect has come from. And I think it led to people trying to figure out, well, when you do endurance training, what happens, and could that inhibit what happens when you do strength training? So, they've looked at fatigue, they looked at molecular differences. And, it's a good thing they did, because they did find some differences there. But it was much later when they started to actually, what if we just try and manipulate some of the training variables? We can actually reduce this interference effect. So, it's become a bit more practical. So, I mean, research takes a long time, and it always starts in the lab and slowly works its way to become more ecologically valid. So, it's just taking that journey. So, it's cool.
Just two things on that. And so, would it be partly to do with just the rate of recovery, so that if, for instance, because I'm now thinking this is purely a personal question then, because obviously trying to now do high rocks and powerlifting at the same time with two competitions, so it's peaking pretty much at the same time as well. Would adding in more like, say, zone 2 style running, so I'm getting the ability to have that trauma essentially of running, because that's what it is to my body at the moment, but managing my heart rate lower, so I'm not stressing the body too much in the aerobic stuff, but then obviously having and maybe training ever so slightly sub-maximally, so then when I get to my competition, I can kind of display some strength, because I'm now weighing this up. I'm like, I realize, am I actually going to be able to perform? Because I'm always, not only, by the way, just as a caveat here, not only am I doing this, I'm also dropping 6 kilos in body weight as well. So, I'm really going all in on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great start, because yes, if you start adding in zone 2 type training, it's going to be less fatiguing from like a cardiovascular sense. As you start to introduce it, because you haven't done for a while, there might be some level of DOMS, some kind of because running is going to create some, your leg acts like a strut, doesn't it? There's an ECG component to it, and that has shown to affect endurance performance because of how it affects the third and fourth afferent nerves, which are also involved with ventilatory responses. So I think you're definitely right in starting low at first, because you need to know how your body recovers from the additional endurance training. But you got to think of it from like a muscle damage / fatigue point of view. Because if you did like a submaximal weightlifting session, I bet you would recover incredibly quickly from that, because you're to that stimulus. Whereas if you add in for endurance training, especially running, because as a powerlifter, what's your body mass?
I'm 100 kilos coming down to 94.
So yeah, in terms of running, that's a heavy athlete.
Yeah.
So because of that, there's more stress placed on the body. So, the body has to then see how well it
Yeah.
recovers from that. There's a really good study which I think highlights what's going on. They had two groups where one was a group of powerlifters, but they didn't do any endurance training at all. And then the other group was a group of cyclists that never did any strength training. So they got both groups to do the same strength training session and then measured what kind of molecular response they had. And then they did an endurance training session and then measured the molecular response from both groups. So you've got one group is doing a session that they're very familiar with and one group that's doing a session that they're not familiar with. And what they found was with the powerlifting lot, if we use them as the example, their mTOR response, the molecular response involved with protein synthesis, was pretty low. And you think, well, they're powerlifters, isn't that what they want? Protein synthesis, prolonged hypertrophy, all that sort of thing. But their AMPK response from the endurance training session was huge. So clearly, if the stress is novel to the athlete, they're going to have a higher molecular response to that because they're like, well, this is new, this is big, I need to try and do what I can to adapt to it. So for me, that says that, okay, if you start adding in endurance training, you're going to have a huge AMPK response to that because the body wants to improve mitochondrial function, for example. But a lot of your strength training, you probably wouldn't have the same mTOR response. To get that same mTOR type of response, you're probably going to have to lift quite a lot or do like intense bodybuilding type session. With your powerlifting stuff, you've probably got times during the week where you're going to really try and lift heavy and times where it's more accessory, maybe light, that sort of thing. So your big sessions are the ones where you're going to get the bigger molecular response in terms of mTOR. And so you want to keep those sessions away from the endurance sessions because that molecular response from the endurance session could impede that.
Makes sense.
But it's less likely to impede your sessions which don't involve as much weight because you're not getting the same type of molecular response. You get the less of the crossover. So you start to see that your lighter sessions, while they're important for developing other physical qualities, they also act like a bit like a recovery session.
Yeah, I see that. And it's in my head, I'm kind of just relating that as thinking like the start of my week is, say, squat and bench Monday, deadlift on Tuesday, that those sessions where they're a lot more nervous system draining and stressful, that, I do need that recovery bit. So then keeping the aerobic stuff until the back end of the week, say Thursday, Friday, when I do my accessory squats, my accessory, or my extra bench sessions and my accessory deadlifts, that's in the optimal time to then be throwing that in. Makes sense. Just on that, because you kind of touched on this, and I kind of then was the other kind of tangent I wanted to kind of touch on is you talk about how obviously the stuff starts in the lab, but in a way it kind of starts in the bro science world of the gym. So you're looking at the bros, like the bodybuilders, all the this works, this is really good for hitting your quad and stuff like that. And then it kind of goes to the lab. In my head, it goes to then into the science world of people saying, is this actually true? And then it comes back around, and then all along, those bros actually kind of know what they were doing. They might not have been exactly right, but they were on the right path a lot of the time.
Yeah, I was going to ask a similar question just to piggyback on that. When you were talking about the weak structure and separating the really heavy stuff from the stuff. Well, one question actually, just for the listeners' benefits, could you explain AMPK? Just because I don't think that's common language, please.
Yeah, sorry, I was throwing terms out. So AMPK is adenosine monophosphate kinase. So it's a kinase, so it tries to speed up chemical reaction. And that is in turn trying to activate certain proteins so that it can then improve mitochondrial function, biogenesis, that sort of thing. I'll try and explain the molecular side of things just so it doesn't seem too like these are still just numbers to me. So when you do endurance exercise, I'm assuming most people are aware of ATP that gets broken down for energy. Yeah. So when you do that, you break away one of the phosphates. So then that reduces it down to adenosine diphosphate. And if you break another one, it's adenosine monophosphate. So the body recognizes when this happens because it sees this increase in adenosine monophosphate or adenosine diphosphate in the blood. So it then responds to that because it wants to generate more energy, because it wants to then bring things together, get more ATP so it can continue breaking it down for energy, which is what you do in endurance exercise. You keep going, don't you? So that's why it activates these particular pathways. So, and what it does is that it needs to generate enough energy or regenerate energy so that energy can then be utilized for muscle contraction. So if your muscle is bigger, then the body will have to generate more energy for that muscle contraction. The body doesn't want to do that because it's knackering. It's trying to be efficient and save energy. So that's where you get this link between the molecular pathways for generating protein synthesis to increase the size of the muscle because it's been imposed with stress that it needs to adapt to. But then the other side of the body, when you start saying, I need to produce force over a long period of time, it's like, hold on, that's hard to generate that much energy for something that big. I don't want to do that. So it's an example of what's known as a molecular brake. And we actually have several in the body. So are you familiar with those like cows that are like stacked, look like they've been benching?
Yeah.
So that's a myostatin deficiency. It's a myokine. And that's another example. Like if you're deficient in that myokine, then the body is able to get bigger. Like the presence of myostatin is there to try and stop the body getting too big because it's less efficient being bigger.
Because there was that athlete, wasn't there? Wasn't it a female athlete with higher levels of or something like that? I'm pretty sure. Am I chatting it? I think so.
I don't know too much about that, I have to admit, but there was something around like the amount of testosterone they produce, and it provided an advantage in some events, but not others. So hormones certainly isn't my area, but there's a few people where you're like DK Metcalf, like that guy doesn't seem to do much training, yet he's like bodybuilding ready. There must be something where he might be, I don't know, maybe myostatin is a bit inhibited in him, so he's just able to generate those muscle size. I don't know. I'm really speculating, but that's where you get this overlap of the interference effect. Like the AMPK molecular pathway is trying to regulate the mTOR pathway, the one that's trying to improve muscle size, because it doesn't want to produce more energy because it's less efficient.
So is that one mechanism by which like mixed modal training could actually kill your stimulus, in that if you're trying to do hypertrophy work and trying to do endurance work in very close proximity, you're actually reducing the mTOR stimulus for muscle growth and you're reducing the AMPK stimulus, which will help you produce more energy for longer for endurance?
Yes. However, the research on this isn't as conclusive as we first thought, and which might explain why we're seeing such improvement in CrossFit, where they have like the strength piece, then they do the Metcon, because you thought like, well, they're competing. Why are you doing it next to each other? And it kind of makes sense if you want to separate them in terms of molecular pathway, because the mTOR one is trying to repair itself, isn't it? So that can remain elevated for a long period of time after your strength training session. Whereas AMPK, as soon as you stop exercising, there's no requirement for energy. Well, there is, but nowhere near as much. So it stops. So, the chances of these like clashing are quite small if you're very smart with your programming. Now, in terms of like having things in the same session, that's probably one of the main factors which shows an interference effect in the literature. However, in terms of the molecular pathways, there's recent studies. There's one in this year from Northumbria where they did like a low intensity endurance session and then a high intensity interval type session and tried to look at the molecular responses to that. And they had a strength session before that. But what they were seeing is that mTOR increased and then AMPK increased. But the terms of like trying to regulate that wasn't that much, although the high intensity one was leaning that way, but not statistically significant. So you might, to develop a really strong molecular response to get this clash between them two, you might really have to train like high intensity, like real high intensity. So it just makes sense that, okay, if you've got a really high intensity session involving endurance training or high intensity intervals, just keep it a little bit separate from your main strength session, just to try and avoid it as much as possible. But again, if they're just submaximal stuff, maybe the responses aren't going to be as strong, so the interference effect isn't going to be as strong. So that's why I think it's back to like, okay, if it's your like main session, whether it be endurance or whether it be strength, just try and be careful with what else is around it, just so you can try and maximize that.
Does that clash with the consolidation of stresses approach, where I remember way back in the day, Alex Viada used to talk about putting your heavy stuff with your fast stuff. So he'd do his heavy lifting with those fast intervals. But it sounds like that study suggests that's not the best place to put them.
It's tricky, and this is the area that I'm probably not fully decided on what the answer is, and there needs to be a lot more, because there's some studies which have shown that when you do the sprints, and these were like 6-second sprints, that it can kind of shut off mTOR. But there's also some studies that show that there was no difference. And for a lot of people, sprints, whether it be sprinting on a bike, whatever it might be, and putting them together, kind of makes sense because the body has to produce force quickly. The body doesn't recognize if you're in a gym or if you're on a bike. It just recognizes how you produce force, really. So if you're putting them together, it kind of makes sense, because, you know, sprints on a bike, how's it any different to like a set of 5 where you're trying to maximally do power cleans or something like that? The body might not recognize it as that much different, because it's quite short. When you start to increase that to maybe like 45 seconds, 60 seconds, I'm not sure, but it's something I have done, but have no idea if it's like increase the interference effect for me. But it might help in terms of trying to balance your fatigue over the week.
Yeah, it's definitely fascinating, because then when you do look at CrossFit as an example, it seems to break all rules, because you look, but again, when we're looking at CrossFit, we are looking at the elite. So you're looking at that 1% that has made it. So when you can't really base obviously the CrossFit whole methodology necessarily off of that 1%. But when you look at the top level 1%, forgetting about any accusations about whatever, they all pretty much look very similar. The bodies are grow. The women and the men, they look very like the body changes and it adapts in an interesting way. So there's again, they're going to go through phases of focusing a bit more on strength and, let's say, endurance work and stuff. But they do combine so much together that, as you say, a lot of this stuff is definitely still out there, because we're learning so much. And I think CrossFit has been a really good example of the body is an amazing thing that is so adaptable, and how it's changing. We just don't understand how it's doing what it's doing. And then we're watching athletes get stronger and stronger every single year, younger and younger athletes coming in as well, because obviously they're getting a lot better training history in that chosen style of fitness, that we don't know what the potential is.
Yeah, I think the research is kind of behind what CrossFit is doing. If we talk about training as your canvas, like that's a perfect example of, you know, people doing things, finding things out, and they don't necessarily match what we're finding in the literature. If you speak to the researchers, they are pretty open to it, actually, you know, based on, you know, what the literature currently says, and like maybe there's something more here. So it isn't around, you know, researchers saying one thing and then you've got coaches saying another, because I know there's like that was one of the reasons I started the podcast, because I just noticed there seems to be this like war between coaches and researchers, and it just didn't make sense to me. Like it was like that. Everyone has their skill set.
Yeah,
it's cool. We don't have to like. I'd rather learn off others that have a better skill set.
Definitely.
Coaching rather than yeah.
So I guess this kind of I can kind of loop it back to my question originally, say about like the bro science stuff. So how, like, for me, thinking about, so using then even that example of CrossFit, so looking out, watching what's going on in CrossFit, and then the labs essentially say, right, this is not what we thought, or this is a question that has been put forward. Let's now study this, and then it comes back to the forefront, and actually you could probably do it a little bit better, or this is why this is working, not quite what you thought, but this is why this is working. So have you found that the you like any have you do you find that you get a lot of say because obviously you mentioned the gym is your canvas as well as the programming, have you found questions coming to you from like bro science and stuff like that, and that you're trying to prove now while you're in the labs?
I'm not sure from like a bro science type of way.
Right.
Definitely from, a lot of what we're seeing in CrossFit is they're elite, and there are not many studies involving elite participants because they want to do their own thing. They don't want to have their, it's very observational almost sometimes. You want to get the top guys, like they do what they want to do, but you're just going to try and collect as much data from them to try and find some understanding. It's very N=1, but it still provides some information. But yeah, there's definitely a number of different ideas that have come from it. One particular, I had a conversation with Evan Pycon, and he was talking about how body shapes are changing, especially in the men's. So do you remember back in the day with like Froning, Bailey, back in like 2014?
Yeah.
They're absolutely jacked.
Yeah.
And now we're getting like a Medeiros, a Vellner, maybe even a Karenikov. I mean, I was looking at the top 10, and they look athletic, they look big, but they don't look bodybuilder stage ready.
Like, 2014 style CrossFit athletes with like delts that are popping, traps up to their ears, and you're like, what's going on there?
And I'd like to know a bit more about why that could be, and I think it's the changes in training methodology. Because, okay, if we train for hypertrophy, that's great because, having a bigger muscle size can help with improving muscular force. It's not linear, that relationship, but it can help. But what I think it teaches, if you spend a lot of time doing hypertrophy type training, our muscles are very good at providing tension, but they're chasing that particular metabolic environment where you get like the muscle pump, you hit like 8-10 reps, and all of a sudden like your muscle output just goes down. And that's exactly the opposite of what you want in a lot of CrossFit events. So if you've done loads of hypertrophy training where the body sort of assumes that, or maybe you are genetically predisposed to hypertrophy, then all of a sudden you've got this sort of muscle physiology, which isn't great if you need to do like a set of 25 or 30 thrusters. Even in my own training, and this is probably where the questions come from, I could do quite a lot of high reps of, I don't know, lower body exercises, squats, that sort of thing. Which, because we run, we do endurance exercise, we do a number of things where our body has to produce force, relax, produce force, relax. So it's better at it just through training. Whereas you don't really have that as much in the upper body. And probably years of wanting to be big and looking jacked for like rugby or whatever the sport is, you get me doing like a set of 12 with like dumbbell thrusters, and all of a sudden I can't even move my arms. And I think a lot of that is just because of years and years of training that have focused on hypertrophy have just made them very inefficient of producing submaximal forces for longer. So I wonder from that, people are realizing it and doing more training where it's less focused on hypertrophy, and they do strength work, which may develop more neurological adaptations, and then more endurance work to develop the muscle physiology good for that. But you don't get this sort of like middle hypertrophy ground as much. So because of that, it's changing body shapes we're seeing. So I'm still kind of speculating here, to be honest, but it kind of makes sense with what I'm seeing. And yeah, I think that'll be an exciting thing to look at.
I definitely think you're right with what you're seeing, because when you're looking at the younger athletes now coming in as well, like the physiques that are developing there, and you're now so we're now seeing, as you say, that more athletic looking physique. You're not getting the old school throw-ins, and obviously these guys are now mid-30s, so they've come from the early days of CrossFit, the bodybuilding as well, like prior to CrossFit probably as well, in the gyms with the S&C stuff. And yeah, it's a really interesting transition, and yeah, it's really cool to watch.
Phil, so I think for me, the hypertraining and CrossFit question, we can almost boil down to, in a given time frame, is it more efficient to train things in isolation, or is it more efficient to train things together? Like in 3, 6, 9, 12 months time, will I be better off if I did one at a time or if I did them all together? If you were to design an experiment to establish that, what would the key setup variables be, and how would you control against some confusing artifacts which would arise? And I think the standard CrossFit program, there's so much changing, it's very difficult to determine whether things are interfering or not, because people generally get better anyway because they're just training more than they used to. But how could we ask that question more intelligently?
I think in terms of novice to moderate type athletes, I think they will be relatively okay if they start combining things a lot more. As soon as you get into that very elite, you're going to have a higher training volume, frequency, and intensity to keep progressing. So that's when you might start to think, okay, I need to start splitting things up. That makes sense from the literature, but like everything's so multifactorial, I think people don't always take into account how that then affects everything else in your life. Because like those metabolic issues we talked about earlier about affecting mTOR, anything to affect the protein synthesis, which has been seen as like the molecular reason for the interference effect. But so does being in the calorie deficit. So does being in having shitty house sleep. Like there's so many other lifestyle factors that affect that as well. So you could design this perfectly scientific study program based on all of this. But if it isn't logistically feasible, then it can have other indirect factors which actually cause the issues you're trying to avoid through your programming. So yeah, it's a tricky one. In terms of study, I think we need to know a bit more around when you combine certain, this idea of CrossFit coaches often call them pieces, don't they? You've got a strength piece and then you've got a Metcon piece or something like that. And then, what are the responses when you start combining things like that? And especially together, like we saw when they combined the stuff in that original study, that things got worse around the 6 to 7 weeks. What happens if we progressed a little bit slower? Probably would have just continued on, and that's just good programming. That's not like science. It's science, but it's just good programming. So yeah, I in terms of like a programming study, because of how difficult it is, I think we still need to focus a bit more on specific things as to like what are the responses when you start to add things together. It's a bit more acute. And then once we start adding things together and more long term, we can start to understand the sort of chronic effects. But I think it's like a rule of thumb. If you've got like your main sessions, which are like the high intensity sessions, they're the ones that put you most at risk of the interference effect. So you need to improve your programming around that to try and just reduce the chance of that happening. And if you manage that quite well, then you should be doing well. I think as long as you're consistent, you should be able to progress at a good pace. And when I say consistent, if you start to add 3 or 4 things in that you want to improve on, try and progress slowly. Slow and steady wins the race. The old hair and the People are so like, I'm only going to get 50% as strong if I did hybrid training as if I did strength on its own. It's like, well, I don't care. Like, remeasure yourself. You're still getting stronger. And maybe my approach to that has come from like S&C within sport, because people have been so focused around specific numbers. Like, okay, maybe your aim was like 20 kilos in the squat, but you only reached 10, but like you got stronger. That's the main thing. And the ones that always seem to do poorly are the ones that peak and then they trough. Like my biggest bench ever. No, hold on. My biggest squat came after doing one of those Russian squat programs.
Same.
And everything's so intense. But what's the point of peaking for one bit when like a few weeks later I've changed my mind and I've lost everything that I gained in that intense period. Like the best trainers are the ones that progress positively over years. And because we keep doing, I did an 8-week training here on this thing, and I did an 8-week training thing on this thing, we're just seeing these peaks and troughs, but our baseline never really moves. I think with hybrid training, we should be able to
You've
move
got to lock it
slowly
in. Yeah.
consistently, and then you just may tweak it based on your goals, because they can change. But if you change them so ridiculously that you're like, okay, I'm going to do a weightlifting competition, then I'm going to do a triathlon competition, but like one's all in weight training and the other's all in endurance, you're probably going to get to a point where you're just going up pace, rather than progressing slowly in the right direction.
You mentioned earlier regression when you stop training one side of the spectrum, and it made me think of a few different case studies. And I guess in CrossFit, you get the classic athlete phenotypes of somebody who's either very strong or very fit and very poor in the other one. And I'm thinking particularly of an athlete like Hayley Adams, who's incredibly enduring, but her strength is clearly what holds her back from doing better in CrossFit overall. For somebody like that, because she's got such a good, well-established, locked-in base of endurance, if she literally just dropped all of her cardio and went all in on a strength program, I guess this is the fundamental question of hybrid training. Would she end up in an overall better shape for CrossFit next year than if she continued everything concurrently, where she's still doing Metcon, she's still doing cardio pieces, she loves a 10-mile run, but is her love for those endurance pieces, which she's already one of the best at, hurting her ability to get strong? And I think that's one of the cornerstone questions of how do you make a CrossFit athlete as competitive as possible. What are your thoughts on athletes like that?
Yeah, my first question is, and I'm not 100% sure how we would test this, would be to try and understand, what is the minimums that she can do to try and maintain that already high level of endurance, and then do that, because that's probably going to cut it down by a certain amount, and that frees up a bit more time where you can focus more on the strength stuff. So, it's more about, okay, if we need to make big leaps in one aspect, either strength and endurance, what is the limited least amount of work that I could potentially do that's going to keep one at the same level? Because dropping it completely will certainly work short term, but I don't think it will help long term, because we've gone past that threshold. The problem is that threshold is different for everyone. So trying to determine what is the minimum amount is really quite difficult. It's really difficult for certain athletes who love that style of training. I'd be the same with strength training. Strength training is probably my favorite bit. So I could probably maintain my strength. Well, I'm not very strong, so it's probably pretty easy to maintain my strength. But I probably do more just because it makes me feel better. And that's why you should always get someone else to program for you, to be honest.
Yeah.
You're always stuck with your own classes, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, thank you. I think it's probably the area that, or the question that most coaches are asking when they have athletes like that is, what can I get away with? How much time and recovery capacity can I free up from their strengths so that I can spend some focused time developing their weaknesses? And I haven't seen anything that gives a really conclusive answer. And that's, I think, where CrossFit coaching and programming is evolving so quickly, because everyone's playing with these different approaches. You do hear some people drop the cardio completely to focus on strength, and then if the athlete has a long history of that cardio fitness, then I think the regression will be slower and it will return much faster. Whereas if somebody's only recently become fit, then it's almost like weight loss. If you've only recently lost the weight, it will come on much faster. Whereas if you've been at the same weight for a really long period of time, you'll find it much easier to maintain that weight. So, I think it's a fascinating area to keep an eye on.
What are the hybrid approaches? Because you both, is it train at WIT? Work at WIT? Yeah. What's the what are the practices that they do there? I'm because it sounds, from what I see on Instagram, I know you shouldn't take everything from Instagram, but it looks like there's several different coaches. Each one might have their own different approach. What kind of things happens at WIT?
All sorts happen at WIT. So the main class program is for Gen Pop, essentially. So keen CrossFitters, but training typically, hopefully, once a day. And it's a balanced CrossFit program, which has periodization. So there'll be a focus on a particular aspect of CrossFit to emphasize that more, but you never drop any of the other key areas. So there's always elements of strength, gymnastics, weightlifting, and conditioning. It's just the relative balance that gets shifted. But then you get a whole bunch of people doing lots of different individual programs in open gym, and that's where the variation really comes in, because people will be training, minimum 90 minutes, sometimes up to 3 hours, and if they're really looking to be competitive, maybe beyond that.
That'd be the dream.
Yeah, in those situations, it obviously becomes a much higher priority to periodize and be strategic with where you're placing your recovery efforts. And yeah, I think it's done to varying levels of success, because sometimes people spread themselves too thin and end up not making much progress in any area. Other times people go all in on a specific cycle to get really good at one element of CrossFit, and then the question is, can they bring everything back up to the boil in time for their competition or for the open? And I think that's where I see the most success, is almost having the faith that you can let your strength go on simmer for long enough to develop your weaknesses. And I've got a client who was an outstanding runner, and fitness has always been his strength, like capacity, strength, and some technique stuff are the things that hold back his CrossFit performance. And he trusted me to let his fitness drop on the faith that in 6 to 8 weeks before the open it would come back, and it did. And he came back way fitter than he was before, just because he's got that well-established base of cardiovascular conditioning. So when he layered on all the CrossFit stuff as well, it ended up putting him in a much better CrossFit position than if he'd maintained that cardio fitness throughout and maybe made small improvements. But I think the game of CrossFit, he was losing so many positions on the leaderboard because of the other things that he might have gained a couple more from being a little bit fitter. But to maximize his overall performance, that's not where he should have spent his training effort. So those are the trade-offs that I'm really interested in to get the individual from A to B in the most efficient way possible. But there's like you said, there's so many variables that you need to factor in, like the training age and history. Like how long have they had those skills? How will dictate how long you can let them go off the boil before you have to top them up. Like what frequency do they need to touch up that motor pattern before it starts to degrade? If they've only just got their double unders, you can't really leave those double unders in the cupboard for months, because when they come back out, they'll start tripping constantly. So do I need to have them in twice a week just to make sure that they're still improving that efficiency alongside all the other things that you've got to get somebody better at in CrossFit? So it is such a complex but fascinating equation to solve, I think.
I did find that as well with my own training as well, because how back in, say, when we opened up WIT, say around 2018-ish, and then so I was pretty much all in at CrossFit that bit for a couple of years, pretty much, and right up until, I'd say about COVID, maybe just before COVID, pretty much like giving it a proper go, learned all the skills, was decent-ish, and then COVID come, obviously all my training kind of changed, and I've always been a strength athlete at heart, and I've kind of geared back to more just straight powerlifting. But now I've just been enjoying, where I'm now working as well somewhere else, is bringing in some mixed modality again. And I've still got all of my movements. It's the efficiency of them. Like, for instance, with gymnastics, I can still do a bar muscle up. But I know I'm not doing it anywhere near as efficiently as I can. Same as a handstand walk, double unders. I did some double unders the other day. And I was straight in, doing them probably faster than I've ever done them, not tripping as well. So I was like, it's a skill that did ingrain, and it didn't take much to bring it back. But then I guess with my training history and how long I had those skills while I was doing CrossFit, I'd probably have to leave them even longer till I completely forgot the ability or have them efficiently.
Well, some things are like riding a bike, right?
Yeah.
They just do stick. But like you say, the efficiency is the key thing. Like runners will always be good at, if they've done a lot of running, they'll always be good at running. But their economy will suffer if they don't run as regularly as if they continue to train. So it is that spinning plates exercise of what do I need to keep refreshing and what can I let simmer.
Your point regarding your athlete that you work with, in terms of like, if we kept pushing the endurance stuff, he might have gained a few places, but focusing on his weaknesses meant that he gained a lot of places. It is almost going, well, that's the aim of CrossFit, isn't it? Your aim is to get as many points as possible.
Yeah.
So in terms of trying to maximise the points, it does seem like Medeiros didn't win any event, did he, this year? But he won the CrossFit Games because it was the most generalised. And all of a sudden, that has to be one of the key things that influences your programming in terms of where you start to focus, because you need as many points as possible. Isn't as like you need to be as fit as possible. No, you need to be as fit in order to get as many points as possible in fitness games. And I think there's a slight difference there. And so it applies to all of the different facets of CrossFit. So.
What was fascinating as well about the games is watching at the point where Ricky Garrard lost it on the basically is the yoke event, the yoke and the deadlifts, the power clean, and like that, and it's mental to see that and obviously the handstand push-up one. The handstand push-up was, I think, the first where they had to face the opposite way around, so it showed like a basic fundamental skill that they should be able to do, but because it's not the norm, right, they then wasn't able to adapt. But with Medeiros, he was able to, he's so well-rounded that turn him the other way around, he's got good enough hollow body position, he's got a good enough overall strength that he was able to then get through that event above average, whereas Ricky Garrard was just at the back of the pack, and that was the first bit where Medeiros got a lot closer to him, and then that strength event just took it out of him. And it was a fascinating thing to see that transition between Medeiros and Garrard.
That's exactly it. You can't afford to suck at anything. Like if you have one bad event, that can ruin your whole competition. So and say you do have one bad event and you finish 40th, if you work on that weakness and you go from 40th to 30th, that's a huge jump up the leaderboard compared to if you're already good at something and you come top 5. The most you can gain is 4 positions. So in terms of where the effort will yield most reward competitively, the weaknesses are the low-hanging fruit. So it's always where your focus should be, not to give away too many of my secrets, but that's definitely how I see it.
Mate, it was a good game, wasn't it?
Yeah. I want to be respectful of your time. There's so many more things on the list that we wanted to talk to you about, so maybe we'll have to do a part 2. I'm
keen. Just let me know.
We'd love to have you back. Yeah. And where can people learn more about you? Tell us about your podcast and your various links, please.
Yeah, cool. So The Progress Theory. So that's my podcast. You can find that on Instagram at The Progress Theory. You can also find me personally at Dr. Phil Price. I'm mainly on Instagram, and I'm trying to develop the YouTube page a little bit as well, but ironically, need to get my camera a bit sorted before I push with that. Those are probably the 2 places that people can get in contact if they have any questions, and I try and put out as much ideas as possible on Instagram. It's ideas for future discussions, rather than people just to take me at face value. If anyone has any questions or anything like that, please just contact me there.
Yeah, I can highly vouch for the Instagram and the YouTube shorts as well. I think something we were talking about before we started recording was where do you find good information? And I think you do a great job of summarizing good information into the attention economy of short soundbitey clips, which is rare.
So difficult. At least with a lecture, you can just go off on one with each slide. You really can't. People just, if they're not interested within 8 seconds, they're gone. So it's a different medium, isn't it? But it is what it is.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your time. We really, really appreciate it, mate.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
Cheers, Bob.